The night was thick, heavy with the smell of diesel and a coming storm, but the violence that erupted was colder than any tropical squall. In the absolute darkness, 18,000 yards away, an unseen enemy was calculating coordinates, completely outside the range of Japanese eyes. The silence was broken by an astronomical anomaly. Columns of water, impossibly accurate, erupting around the flagship Yamashiro. Zero visibility, zero warning. The Japanese admirals had bet their entire naval heritage on the idea that darkness belonged to them, and that technology was a clumsy American gimmick. They were wrong. And in the span of less than 30 minutes, an entire battle group, a proud legacy of imperial strength, simply dissolved into the abyss, hunted down not by superior courage, but by invisible waves.
This is the story of the technological gap that sank an empire. The moment when the Imperial Japanese Navy's ingrained belief in optical superiority and the samurai fighting spirit met the cold, calculating reality of American invention. We are talking about the Battle of Surigao Strait, October 25, 1944, an engagement that serves not just as a footnote to the larger Battle of Leyte Gulf, but as the starkest military lesson in the history of naval power. Hubris kills faster than any torpedo.
By the fall of 1944, the global war machine was grinding into its final phase. The Americans, having pushed across the Pacific, were poised to retake the Philippines, a strategic move that would sever Japan's critical oil supply lines from Borneo and Sumatra. For the Imperial Japanese Navy, this was the ultimate crisis. They understood that if the Philippines fell, the war was effectively over. They designed Operation Shogo-1, a desperate, complex plan intended to sacrifice the fleet for a final, decisive blow against the U.S. invasion force.
The plan was audacious, relying heavily on split-second timing and luck. 3 main task forces, led by Admirals Kurita, Shima, and Nishimura, were instructed to converge on Leyte Gulf simultaneously. The most crucial role of all was handed to Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura's Southern Force. His task was simple yet deadly: steam through the narrow, treacherous Surigao Strait and strike the American landing transports anchored inside the Gulf. It was a suicide mission, but the reward, destroying the invasion fleet, justified the cost, or so Tokyo believed.
Nishimura's force was small but potent, centered on 2 relics of the past: the battleships Fuso and Yamashiro. These were pre-dreadnought-era giants, refitted and powerful, but fundamentally aging vessels built on early 20th century design philosophies. The Japanese doctrine demanded that they maximize the element of surprise, focusing on a night attack where American air superiority would be negated. They held absolute faith in their ability to fight in the dark, leveraging highly trained optical spotters and the famous Long Lance torpedoes. Contrast this with the American defense waiting at the mouth of the strait. Standing guard was the U.S. 7th Fleet Support Force, led by Rear Admiral Jesse Oldendorf. His fleet was unique, a ghostly assembly of history's survivors. His battle line consisted almost entirely of battleships sunk or heavily damaged at Pearl Harbor, now resurrected and modernized, including the West Virginia, Maryland, and California. Their mission was redemption. Their advantage, however, was invisible. Oldendorf was not merely relying on the heavy guns of his recovered fleet. He had set a trap of classical naval warfare, perfected by modern technology. He positioned his ships to execute a crossing the T maneuver, the ultimate tactical advantage. But critically, he augmented his defense with a thick screen of dozens of destroyers and torpedo boats, all equipped with the latest American radar technology. The Japanese, unaware, were steaming directly into a meticulously calculated kill zone. To understand the depth of the tragedy, we must rewind several years and analyze the Japanese mindset regarding technology. When the concept of radar, radio detection and ranging, was first introduced, Japanese naval leadership reacted with profound skepticism, bordering on mockery.
They had mastered night fighting through sheer practice, rigorous training, and superior optical gear. They believed that relying on crude electronic devices was a sign of fundamental deficiency, a lack of Bushido spirit among their opponents. One critical report from a German liaison officer detailing British radar capabilities was reportedly tossed aside by an IJN admiral who scoffed, "If the Americans need electronic crutches to find us, their skill is clearly lacking." This cultural arrogance was reinforced by early Japanese attempts at building their own radar, which were often unreliable, bulky, and poorly integrated. They concluded the technology itself was flawed, not their execution of it. This self-serving denial became a systemic failure. Meanwhile, the U.S. Navy poured billions into refining radar. The Americans recognized that the technology was not a supplement, but a fundamental game-changer, especially the sophisticated SG-series radar used on their destroyers. This equipment allowed commanders to plot targets, estimate range, and track incoming enemy ships with astounding precision, regardless of fog, rain, or absolute darkness. It turned night into day, but only for one side. Admiral Oldendorf understood this disparity perfectly. His trap at Surigao Strait was layered, specifically designed to nullify every advantage the Japanese thought they possessed. The first layer was the patrol torpedo boats, harassing the enemy. The second, and most deadly, was the coordinated destroyer attack. These ships would not rely on luck. They would fire their deadly payloads based on coordinates handed to them by the electronic gods of the radar screen. October 24, 1944. As Nishimura's force steamed toward the strait, they were detected almost immediately, not by human eyes, but by the watchful electronic sweep of patrol aircraft and radar picket ships. Every single mile of the Japanese approach was logged, plotted, and relayed back to Oldendorf. Nishimura, believing his stealth and the darkness were his allies, was sailing into a situation where the enemy knew exactly where he was, his speed, and his precise formation. Nishimura himself exacerbated the vulnerability. Despite receiving warnings that Admiral Shima's task force was dangerously lagging behind him, meaning the crucial convergence plan was already failing, Nishimura adhered rigidly to the timing dictated by Tokyo. His adherence to schedule, rooted in traditional naval discipline, meant he was isolating his force, ensuring that when the hammer dropped, he would bear the full weight of the American trap alone. He sailed straight ahead, refusing to slow down. The stage was set. The narrow waters of the Surigao Strait became the longest, deadliest bowling alley in naval history. First contact came just after midnight. A curtain of American PT boats darted out, launching a flurry of torpedoes. While largely ineffective, these minor attacks served their primary purpose: to force the Japanese ships into evasive maneuvers, confirming their position and disrupting their strict formation, making them perfect targets for the next, much larger wave. The Japanese commanders grew frustrated. They knew they were surrounded by small, darting targets, but their powerful optical equipment was useless against the blackness, and their ships' huge main guns could not track the tiny craft. They were wasting precious ammunition and fuel, burning their limited visibility, and announcing their presence with every futile shell, exactly as Oldendorf intended. The trap was tightening, and the bait was taking the hook. Around 3 a.m., the first truly lethal layer of the trap revealed itself: American Destroyer Squadron 54. These 9 destroyers approached silently and quickly, guided entirely by their radar consoles. The Japanese, still fighting ghosts, had no idea the real killers were closing in. They saw no wakes, heard no engine noise over their own ship's powerful rumbling. They were blind. The U.S. destroyers executed a textbook synchronized attack. From ranges where visual identification was impossible, torpedoes were launched, a lethal salvo totaling 93 deadly fish streaming toward the unsuspecting Japanese line. The U.S. crews reported their radar was so clear they could see the separation between the Japanese battleships and the surrounding destroyers as distinct blips. Within minutes, the strait became a scene of absolute horror. The first battleship hit was Fuso.
Two torpedoes struck simultaneously, one tearing into the fuel bunkers, the other detonating near the amidships boiler room. The resulting explosion was catastrophic, ripping the aged battleship nearly in half. She continued steaming, temporarily, but now as two separate flaming wreckage sections. The damage was instant, irrecoverable, and fundamentally unexpected. The Japanese fleet, now severely fragmented and crippled, attempted desperate evasive action, but they were swamped. Commander Nishimura, aboard the Yamashiro, likely had no coherent view of the chaos unfolding around him. His communication was broken, the darkness absolute, and the enemy was everywhere, yet nowhere. His ships were dissolving one by one, casualties of an attack they couldn't see, couldn't counter, and previously refused to acknowledge existed. The destroyer Asagumo suffered immediate destruction. The destroyer Mishishio was disabled and later sunk. The Japanese were reduced from a coherent attack force to isolated burning targets within a 15-minute window. They had entered the strait with high hopes of a glorious last stand. They found only a rapid, clinical execution, orchestrated by electronic signals they had scorned. But the worst was yet to come. Having neutralized the Japanese escort screen, the remaining Yamashiro was now sailing directly toward the American battle line. This was Oldendorf's ultimate prize, the resurrection ships facing the final vestiges of the Imperial fleet in the last true crossing the T maneuver ever executed by battleships. The visibility was nil, but the radar data was perfect. The American battle line, consisting of 6 battleships and 8 cruisers, waited patiently, their massive 14-inch and 16-inch guns loaded with armor-piercing shells. Each ship had its own fire control radar locked on to the single, tragic target steaming toward them. They knew the range, the speed, and the precise trajectory of the Yamashiro to within meters. The Japanese still could see nothing but the burning wreckage of their comrades. At 3:51 a.m., the U.S. cruiser Louisville opened fire, followed almost instantly by the entire American line. The effect was immediate and stunning. Over 250 heavy shells began raining down on the Yamashiro per minute, guided with terrifying accuracy by the electronic eye. It was not a battle, it was target practice. The Japanese ship was immediately bracketed, hit repeatedly, and overwhelmed by a relentless, invisible storm of steel. The sight, even in the darkness, was horrifying. The Yamashiro became an inferno, riddled with holes, its massive superstructure crumbling under the barrage. Admiral Nishimura sent one final, desperate message back to headquarters. "I am proceeding, notwithstanding heavy damage." This final act of stubbornness, this refusal to acknowledge the totality of his defeat, sealed his fate and that of his remaining crew. He was already doomed. The Americans ceased fire to assess the damage. The Yamashiro was listing heavily, completely ablaze. And just as the artillery subsided, another torpedo strike, delivered by the destroyer Benyon, tore into her flank. The battle wagons of Pearl Harbor had achieved their vengeance, and their gunners had barely needed to rely on their own eyesight to ensure the destruction. It was the purest demonstration of fire control radar supremacy. Within an hour, the Yamashiro capsized and sank, carrying Admiral Nishimura and almost her entire crew to the bottom of the strait. Of the 7 ships in Nishimura's force, only one destroyer, the Shigure, managed to escape, severely damaged by reversing course and fleeing the slaughterhouse. The engagement had lasted less than 2 hours, resulting in the annihilation of a proud naval force. But the story does not end with Nishimura's force. The tragedy was compounded by the arrival of Admiral Shima's support fleet, which was trailing by approximately 40 miles. Shima's radar, though also rudimentary, did pick up the horrific reality of the wreckage floating in the strait, unidentified burning debris and massive oil slicks. Shima hesitated, unsure if he was attacking the enemy or merely navigating a graveyard. In a moment of profound confusion, Shima's flagship, the cruiser Nachi,
accidentally collided with the burning, broken aft section of the Fuso, which was still miraculously afloat. This collision, triggered by poor visibility and the sheer density of destruction, was a fitting, desperate coda to the night's chaos. Realizing the ambush was total, Shima ordered a full retreat, saving his ships, but abandoning the mission entirely. The Battle of Surigao Strait stands alone in history for one definitive reason. It was the last time battleships engaged in a line of battle formation against each other. It was also the only naval engagement in which a commanding force, Oldendorf's line, executed a perfect crossing the T maneuver, thanks entirely to radar. The ghosts of Pearl Harbor were not only avenged, they proved that the age of optical, daylight fighting was irrevocably over. The technological gap was not just a matter of having the devices, it was a matter of integrating them into doctrine and trusting them when everything else failed. While Japanese sailors strained their eyes in the dark, the American sailors were relaxed in their control rooms, reading numbers that translated into precise, deadly trajectories. This disparity illustrates the core military lesson. Technology is only as good as the culture that embraces it. The broader significance for Operation Shogo was devastating. The primary objective of annihilating the American landing forces had completely failed. By dawn, the Central Force under Admiral Kurita, which was supposed to synchronize with Nishimura, had been further mauled by air and submarine attacks, shattering the unified Japanese strategy. The fragmentation caused by the radar-driven annihilation at Surigao contributed directly to the ultimate failure of Japan's final, desperate naval gambit. The Japanese military establishment, even after Surigao Strait, struggled to internalize the lesson. While they attempted to rush the deployment of improved radar systems later in the war, the cultural resistance remained fierce. Senior officers often complained that reliance on electronics made soldiers soft, weakening the critical human element that had traditionally defined Japanese military success. They continued to value the imperfect vision of a highly trained man over the perfect digital precision of a machine. The cost of this technological denialism was staggering. At Surigao Strait alone, Japan lost 2 battleships, 1 heavy cruiser, and 4 destroyers, along with thousands of highly skilled sailors. More critically, they lost the faith in their ability to fight the enemy on equal footing. They were defeated not by a sudden, decisive, heroic maneuver, but by continuous, clinical, overwhelming technological superiority. What the Japanese commanders had laughed at, the crude American crutch, was in fact the blinding flashlight that exposed their every move. The U.S. Navy leveraged radar to effectively erase the tactical benefits of night fighting, turning the darkness, which was once Japan's greatest ally, into their deadliest enemy. This irreversible shift in naval power dynamics defined the remainder of the Pacific War.